My parents left everything to my brother because he deserved it more. Years later, he lost it all, and the only person who could save him was the one he'd cast aside. I knew I was about to get burned the second I saw my parents sitting so close to my brother at the lawyer's table. You could feel the bias before anyone even said a word. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and stale coffee, but all I could really notice was how my father's hand kept resting on Mark's shoulder like he was a winning lottery ticket. The lawyer shuffled some papers, cleared his throat, and started reading. To our beloved son, Mark. That was how it began. And that was how it stayed. Line after line, the words kept pouring out about the family home, the savings account, even my grandfather's pocket watch that he used to let me hold when I was a kid. All of it was bequeathed to Mark. When he finally said my name, I felt my chest tighten. For a second, I let myself believe there might be something, anything, coming my way. Instead, the lawyer read, "And to our son David, we leave our love and best wishes for the future." That was it. Love and best wishes. Not a dime. Not a keepsake. Not even an apology wrapped in lawyer speak. I remember my mother looking at me, her face unreadable, and saying, "We just feel Mark deserves it more. He has always been there for us." She said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Like decades of my own effort, loyalty, and sacrifice had never existed. Mark just sat there, smug as a cat with a full bowl. He did not even try to hide it. I could almost hear his thoughts. Finally, it is all mine. I did not argue. I did not make a scene. I just sat there while the rest of the will got read, hearing my childhood home and every memory tied to it handed over to someone who had never once thought twice about himself. By the time we walked out into the parking lot, the sun was so bright it made my eyes water. Maybe it was the glare. Maybe not. I got in my car, turned the key, and drove off without saying goodbye. That was the day I stopped being their son in any real sense. But here is the thing about walking away. You never know when life is going to circle back and test just how far you have really gone. And years later, that test came. It came with a knock on my door. Looking back, I should have seen the will coming years before it happened. Favoritism in my family was not some secret. It was practically a household rule. Mark was the chosen one before he could even tie his shoes. I was just the extra kid in the family photo, the one who got cropped out when my mom updated her Facebook profile. Mark got the big birthday parties with rented bounce houses and gift tables that looked like a department store display. I got a sheet cake from the grocery store and maybe a $20 bill stuffed in an envelope. When I brought home an A in math, my dad would nod like I had met the bare minimum. When Mark scraped by with a C in the same class, they would talk about how grades aren't everything, and he's more of a people person. Vacations were no different. We once drove down to Florida, and the whole trip revolved around what Mark wanted to do. Theme parks, seafood restaurants he picked. Even the hotel had to be near the beach he liked. I wanted to visit the Kennedy Space Center. The answer was, maybe next time. Next time never came. By the time I was old enough to notice, I had learned not to fight it. Fighting just meant hearing my mom sigh about how you and your brother are so different, and my dad lecturing me about family harmony. So I built my own space. I focused on work, saving money, and getting out. I left for college with a duffel bag, a scholarship, and zero help from home. I rented a room over a garage from an older couple who let me pay late if I needed to. I worked in a grocery store stocking shelves until 2 in the morning, then dragged myself to class half asleep. It was not glamorous, but I was free. Years later, I had my own business, a small but steady thing I had built from nothing. I had no mortgage, no debt, and enough tucked away to know I would never have to ask anyone, especially my family, for help. I figured they had their golden boy to lean on, and I had my peace. That peace lasted a long time. Long enough for me to almost believe I would never hear from them again. Then one morning, I saw Mark's name pop up on my phone. I nearly let it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me. His voice was shaky. He said we needed to talk. Urgently. And for the first time in years, I felt that old knot in my stomach tightening again. When we finally met, it was at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee is burnt but bottomless. Mark looked nothing like the grinning, confident guy from the day of the will. He was pale, thinner, hair starting to gray at the edges. His suit was wrinkled like it had been slept in. I slid into the booth across from him. He did not bother with small talk. "It's gone," he said. I asked him what he meant. "All of it," he said. "The house, the savings, everything Mom and Dad left me. I just stared at him. Years ago, he had been given a fully paid-off home, a solid nest egg, and enough family heirlooms to fill an antique shop. And now gone. He told me the story in bits and pieces between sips of coffee and nervous glances at the door. After our parents passed, he had decided to make the money work for him. That meant pulling out a chunk of the savings for what he called can't-miss investments. Some startup his friend from college was launching, a crypto scheme that was supposed to triple his money in 6 months, and a couple of real estate flips he barely researched. The startup collapsed. The crypto tanked. And the real estate? One house had hidden mold damage so bad it got condemned. The other sat on the market for over a year, draining him with taxes and repairs until he sold it at a loss. Then there was the gambling. He called it a few bad nights in Vegas, but I knew Mark well enough to hear the lie under the words. By the time the dust settled, the savings were gone. The house was mortgaged to cover debts, and the heirlooms, our grandfather's watch, the old cedar chest, even Mom's wedding ring, had been sold off to pawn shops and collectors. He sat there, eyes down, stirring sugar into coffee he was not even drinking. "I need your help," he said finally. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. After everything, being written out of the will, being told he deserved it more, now he was sitting here asking me to bail him out. Before I could answer, he leaned forward, desperation spilling out in his voice. "It's not just me," he said. "If I go under, it's going to take the whole family with me." That stopped me cold. I leaned back in the booth, letting him squirm under the silence. "What do you mean, the whole family?" Mark rubbed his face like he was trying to wake himself up from a bad dream. "They co-signed on a few things. Lines of credit, some loans. It was supposed to be temporary, just until the investments paid off." Temporary. I almost laughed. I could already picture my father signing papers without reading the fine print because Mark asked. My mother nodding along because he knows what he's doing. He went on. After the bad investments started to sink, he had taken out a loan against the house to buy time. But he did not tell the bank he was also juggling credit card debt in the 6 figures. When the interest started piling up, he roped in our uncle to co-sign on a business loan. The business was nothing more than another risky gamble. This time a bar his buddy wanted to open downtown. It folded within 6 months. Now the payments were overdue. The bank was calling in the debts. If he defaulted, the house would go, and the people who had co-signed, our parents' closest friends, a couple of cousins, would be dragged under with him. "They think you'll help," he said quietly. "That you can make it all right." I stared at him, not just at his words, but at the way he said they instead of I. This was not just him begging for a lifeline. It was the whole family, leaning on me like they had every right. I told him I needed time to think. He nodded, but I could see the panic flicker in his eyes. "You don't have much," he said. "They're already talking foreclosure." As I walked out of the diner, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother's sister. "We should talk." Mark said he explained the situation. "We're counting on you." Counting on me. The same people who had cut me out without a second thought were now speaking like my help was a given. By the time I got home, there were 5 more messages waiting. None of them said sorry. And the thing that got me the most? Not one of them asked how I was doing. It did not take long for the calls to turn into visits. The first knock came 2 days later. My cousin Nate stood on my porch, hands in his jacket pockets, wearing that awkward smile people use when they want something but are trying to act casual. He said they had been talking, that family sticks together, and that I was in the best position to fix what Mark had gotten himself into. I asked him if he remembered the day of the will. He shifted on his feet, muttered something about that was different, and said this was not the time to rehash old stuff. Over the next week, it felt like my phone was under siege. Texts, voicemails, even Facebook messages from relatives I had not spoken to in years. They all had the same tone, urgent, expectant, like this was my responsibility. The words, "You've done well for yourself," came up more than once, as if my success automatically meant I was on the hook for cleaning up their mess. One night, I got a long email from my mother's sister. She wrote about how Mark had always had a good heart, how he had fallen in with the wrong crowd, and how this is just a rough patch. The guilt was thick between every line. Then she slipped in the real message. "If you don't help, it will destroy this family." Those words stuck with me, not because I believed them, but because it sounded so familiar. It was the same kind of manipulation I had heard my whole life. The unspoken rule. Keep Mark comfortable, even at my expense. That night, I found myself remembering the last time I had seen them all together after the will was read. They had hosted a celebration of life, gathering for our parents. Mark was the centerpiece, telling stories and soaking up the attention. I had stood near the back, drink in hand, nodding at people who barely remembered my name. I had left early, walking out into the cool night with the decision already made in my head. I was done. No more calls. No more visits. No more playing the forgotten son who still shows up when they need something. And yet, here I was, years later, feeling that same pull again. The difference this time was that I had something they wanted, and they were not going to stop coming until I gave them an answer. I agreed to meet Mark again, mostly because I wanted to hear the whole truth. I picked the place this time, a half-empty coffee shop far from where anyone in our family might wander in. He walked in late, wearing a hoodie instead of the wrinkled suit, and carrying a stack of envelopes so thick it barely fit under his arm. He dropped them on the table. Bills, past due notices, legal letters with bold red stamps. I flipped through them in silence, each page another weight on my chest. The numbers were bigger than I expected, 6 figures in debt, with interest that looked like it was breeding on the page. How did you think you were going to get out of this? I finally asked. He rubbed his forehead. I thought the bar would take off. I thought crypto would bounce back. I thought. He trailed off, shaking his head. Honestly, I thought Mom and Dad would still be around long enough to help if things went bad. That was the first time he looked me in the eye. I didn't think it would come to you. And yet, here we were. The worst part was the property, our childhood home. He had used it as collateral for one of the bigger loans. The payments were months behind. If the bank foreclosed, it would not just be his credit ruined. It would hit everyone who had co-signed, including our uncle and a couple of our parents' old friends. They'll lose their houses, he said quietly. This isn't just me going under. It's all of them. I sat back, staring at him. It was the perfect trap. If I refused, innocent people who had nothing to do with the will, the favoritism, any of it, would get crushed. And if I stepped in, I would be bailing out the same man who had sat there years ago grinning while I got written out of my own parents' estate. I told him I needed the night to think. He nodded, but his shoulders sagged like he already knew what my answer would be. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from one of the co-signers, our uncle's wife. Please, David, you're the only one who can stop this. For the first time since this all started, I felt the weight of a choice that could not be undone. And I realized I had no idea which way I was leaning. They did not even bother hiding it. On Saturday, I walked into my driveway carrying groceries and found 3 cars parked along the curb. Mark was leaning against one, arms crossed, flanked by my aunt and uncle on one side and our cousin Nate on the other. It looked less like a visit and more like an intervention. My aunt stepped forward first, her voice sweet enough to rot teeth. We just want to talk, David. We are all in this together. I set the grocery bags down on the hood of my truck. Funny, I do not remember being in this together when the will was read. She gave a tight smile and pushed on. That was then. This is now. Then my uncle spoke, and it was not a request. If you do not step in, we are going to lose everything. His voice was flat, but his eyes told the truth, panic wrapped in anger. Mark stayed quiet, letting them speak for him. He knew better than to push me himself, but I could feel his stare like a hand on my back, waiting for me to break. Nate started listing the names of people who had co-signed for him, as if rolling them out in order would pile the guilt higher. Some of them had kids in college. Some were near retirement. All of them had trusted Mark, and by extension, all of them would be destroyed if the bank moved forward. And then my aunt hit me with it. 5 words that punched harder than any insult. You can afford to help. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of ownership. My success was not mine. It was a resource for them to claim. The air felt heavy between us. Cars passed on the street. A dog barked down the block. But all I could hear was the thud of my pulse in my ears. I told them I would give them my answer tomorrow. My uncle looked like he wanted to argue, but my aunt touched his arm and nodded. They piled back into their cars, leaving Mark for last. He lingered, hand on the door, and said quietly, "If you walk away, they'll never forgive you." I waited until his taillights were gone before I picked up the groceries and went inside. Tomorrow, it would be decided. And whichever way I went, there would be no going back. That night, I could not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the pile of bills Mark had given me, flipping through them like they might magically shrink if I stared hard enough. Numbers, dates, and interest rates blurred together. But one envelope I had not noticed before caught my eye. It was thicker, heavier. Inside were bank statements. Not from the main accounts he had already told me about, but from an account I had never heard of. The balance was small now, barely enough to cover a month's mortgage payment, but the transaction history told a different story. Just 6 months ago, it had held over $80,000. Then came a series of withdrawals, 10 here, 20 there. Cashier's checks made out to names I did not recognize. One of them was for a luxury resort in the Caribbean. Another to a private car dealership 2 states over. It was not just bad investments. He had been spending lavishly. While the debts piled up and the house hung in the balance, he had been living like nothing was wrong. The next file I opened was a contract. My parents' wedding ring, the one I thought he had pawned out of desperation, had been sold months earlier to a private collector for a fraction of its value. The money from that sale? Gone in a week. This was not just recklessness. This was someone gambling with other people's lives while keeping himself entertained. My chest tightened. All those faces, my uncle, my aunt, the cousins, flashed in my mind. They had no idea. They thought he had gone down fighting for some big dream. They did not know he had been draining the well dry for fun. Suddenly, the guilt they had tried to hang on me started to peel away. Helping him would not just be saving them. It would be enabling him. Again. And for the first time since this started, I knew exactly what my answer was going to be. But delivering it was going to burn every bridge left. I asked them all to meet at the same diner where Mark had first told me it was gone. I wanted everyone in one place. No private phone calls, no secondhand stories. When I walked in, they were already there, clustered in a booth that looked too small for the tension crammed into it. Mark sat at the end, jaw tight, eyes fixed on his coffee. My aunt gave me the kind of smile you give before handing someone a pen to sign their own surrender. My uncle just nodded once, like this was a done deal. I stayed standing. I pulled the thick envelope from my bag and dropped it onto the table. I went through everything, I said, and I found a few things you all should see. Mark shifted in his seat. I started sliding pages out one by one, bank statements, receipts, the sale contract for our mother's wedding ring. I watched their eyes move across the lines, watched their expressions shift from hope to disbelief to something colder. My uncle was the first to speak. "Is this true?" he asked Mark, voice low but sharp. Mark muttered something about not all of it being how it looks, but the words fell flat. The damage was done. I told them the truth, that this was not a man who had fallen victim to bad luck. This was someone who had burned through what he was given and pulled others down with him, all while keeping a separate account to fund his own comforts. Then I gave them my decision. I am not paying off his debts. I will help the co-signers so their homes are safe. But not $1 goes through him. My aunt's mouth opened like she was about to argue, but my uncle cut her off. "If you can do that, it's enough." His voice was tight, but I could tell he meant it. Mark looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in years. There was no gratitude in his face, only something that looked a lot like hate. I leaned in just enough for him to hear me over the clink of dishes. "You had your chance. You thought you deserved it more. This is what that looks like." And then I walked out, leaving the envelope on the table. Outside, the air felt sharp and clean. For the first time since the knock on my door, the knot in my stomach was gone. But I knew there was one more conversation coming. The one where Mark would realize that I had not just cut him off financially. I had cut him out completely. The call started within an hour of me leaving the diner. First from Mark, straight to voicemail. Then from numbers I did not recognize. By the end of the day, my phone showed 19 missed calls and 5 voicemails I had no interest in hearing. I ignored them all. 2 days later, a letter showed up in my mailbox. It was from Mark. His handwriting had always been messy, but this time it looked rushed, angry. He accused me of humiliating him in front of the family, of making things worse by going behind his back. He said if the co-signers accepted my help, they were traitors, and so was I. That same night, my uncle called, not to guilt me, but to thank me. The co-signers had already started working with a lawyer to transfer the debts out of their names using the funds I set aside. They were going to be okay. Mark was not. Word got back to me that the bank had moved forward on the foreclosure. The house, the one my parents had lived in for over 30 years, was going on the market. Most of what was inside had already been sold. He had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Weeks passed without a word from him. Then one evening, just as the sun was going down, there was a knock at my door. It was Mark. He looked older, thinner. No swagger left. He stood there for a long moment before speaking. "I guess you got what you wanted." I told him I had wanted nothing. I had only given him what he had earned. He asked if we could ever be brothers again. I looked at him and thought about the will, the years of favoritism, the debts, the lies, the way he only came to me when his back was against the wall. "No," I said. He did not argue. He just turned and walked away. I watched him go, the sky behind him turning dark. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was the last time I would see him. And for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. Because sometimes walking away is not just about saving yourself. It is about making sure you never get pulled back into the fire you already escaped.